Once upon a time, in a luxurious neighborhood filled with sprawling mansions and manicured lawns, there lived a woman named Emily. To everyone on the outside, her life appeared picture perfect. Emily had once been the epitome of beauty, the kind of beauty that turned heads, stopped conversations, and made everyone whisper in admiration. Her flawless skin, radiant smile, and captivating charm had not only won hearts but also earned her the title of a trophy wife. Her husband, Richard, was a wealthy businessman. He was the kind of man who valued appearances above all else. To him, Emily was not just his wife, she was his prize. In his eyes, her beauty was something to show off, like a luxury car or a designer watch. Richard would beam with pride at glamorous parties, introducing her to colleagues, friends, and strangers alike. "Isn't she stunning?" he would say with a wide grin, his arm firmly wrapped around Emily's waist. People would agree. Emily's beauty seemed timeless, untouchable, almost like a painting in a museum. But life, as we know, is unpredictable. Years passed, and life began to take its toll on Emily. The stress of managing a perfect household, keeping up appearances, and maintaining her image as Richard's perfect wife slowly started to wear her down. The late nights, sleepless worries, and silent cries behind closed doors went unnoticed by everyone, especially Richard. He remained oblivious to her struggles, only seeing what he wanted to see. Then something began to change. Emily, who had once been the queen of elegance, started to look different. Small lines appeared around her eyes, her once glowing skin grew pale, and dark circles began to deepen. Slowly, the sparkle in her eyes faded, replaced by exhaustion and sadness she tried desperately to hide. Richard noticed, of course he noticed. But instead of love and concern, his gaze turned cold. His compliments stopped. The long conversations they used to share were replaced with silence, and the warmth between them vanished like it had never been there at all. To Richard, beauty was everything, and as soon as Emily no longer fit the image of the woman he married, his interest started to wane. One day, it all came crushing down. Richard came home late from work. Emily had prepared dinner and waited for him as usual. She was dressed in her favorite blue dress, her hair tied back, and though she didn't look the way she used to, her love for him was the same, perhaps even stronger. She smiled weakly when he walked in, hoping for a kind word or a simple smile in return. But Richard didn't look at her. He didn't say anything. Instead, he pushed the plate away and sighed loudly. "Emily," he began, his tone sharp and unforgiving, "I can't do this anymore." Emily froze. Her heart raced as she stared at him, not understanding what he meant. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Richard didn't look her in the eye. "Look at you. You're not the woman I married. You've let yourself go, and I don't know if I can stay with you like this." The words cut through Emily like a knife. Her hands shook as she clutched the edge of the table, trying to steady herself. "I've let myself go," she repeated, tears welling in her eyes. Richard didn't answer. He simply stood up, grabbed his keys, and left the house without another word. That night, Emily sat alone in their massive, empty home. She replayed Richard's words over and over, each one hurting more than the last. She had sacrificed so much for him, her time, her happiness, her very self, only to be abandoned when she no longer fit his idea of perfection. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Richard moved on with his life as if Emily had never existed. He was seen at fancy restaurants, smiling with younger, beautiful women on his arm, women who reminded Emily of herself years ago. But life has a strange way of balancing the scales. While Richard thought he had won, something extraordinary was happening in Emily's life, something no one could have expected. It was slow, almost invisible at first, but with each passing day, Emily began to rediscover herself. The woman who had once been defined by her beauty and her role as a wife started to find strength in something far deeper. She began to live for herself, not for the approval of others. And as for Richard, well, Let's just say that karma has a way of showing up when you least expect it. But what happened next will leave you speechless. Stay tuned to find out how Emily turned her life around and why Richard would regret the day he ever walked out on her. Emily spent days in the silence of her once lively home. It was strange how a house so full of memories could suddenly feel like a stranger's place. The ticking of the clock echoed in the stillness, a constant reminder of how long she had been sitting alone. At first, she kept hoping Richard would return. She imagined him walking through the front door, apologizing for the cruel words he had said. Maybe he'd realize how much she meant to him, how much love she still had to give. But as the days turned into weeks, those hopes faded, and reality settled in like an unwelcome guest. Richard wasn't coming back. The whispers started soon after. Friends, well, people she thought were friends, stopped calling. The neighbors, who once smiled and waved as she passed by, now looked at her with pity in their eyes. Emily could feel their judgment, like invisible hands pulling her down further. "Did you hear about Richard and Emily?" she overheard once at the grocery store. "He left her for someone younger. She really let herself go." She turned away quickly, pretending not to hear, but the sting of those words stayed with her. It was as if her worth as a human being had vanished the moment her appearance changed. Was that really all she had ever been to people? A trophy on Richard's arm, a pretty face to admire. The more she thought about it, the more the truth weighed on her. For so long, Emily had measured her value by how she looked, how people admired her, and how Richard loved her. But now, standing alone in the reality of what her life had become, she couldn't help but feel empty. She didn't recognize herself anymore, not just physically, but emotionally too. It was as if pieces of her identity had been chipped away over time, and now there was nothing left but the shell of the woman she once was. One evening, after hours of sitting in front of her untouched dinner, Emily finally broke. She picked up a small framed photo from the table beside her. It was her wedding photo. She remembered the day so clearly, how excited she'd been, how proud Richard looked as he held her hand. They had promised each other forever. But forever had turned into a broken promise, all because of something as temporary as appearance. Anger began to replace the sadness that had consumed her for so long. She felt it bubbling inside her, growing stronger with every passing moment. Why had she allowed Richard's cruel words to define her? Why had she spent so many years living for someone else's approval? She had given so much to him and their life together, and in return he had abandoned her as if she were disposable. That realization hurt more than anything else. Emily decided that night that she wasn't going to let Richard's actions destroy her. She couldn't go back in time and change what had happened, but she could decide what came next. It was time to take back control of her life, piece by piece, no matter how difficult it might be. The next morning, Emily did something she hadn't done in months. She got out of bed early, showered, and dressed in something other than the oversized clothes she had been hiding in. She stood in front of the mirror, looking at her reflection. Yes, she looked different. Her face carried the marks of the years gone by, and there was a wariness in her eyes. But she also saw something else, something she hadn't noticed before. There was strength there, buried deep but still present, waiting to be found. For the first time in a long time, Emily smiled. It wasn't a perfect smile or a confident one, but it was real. She started small. She began taking walks around the neighborhood every morning, feeling the fresh air on her face and the warmth of the sun on her skin. At first, it felt strange. People still stared, and Emily couldn't help but feel self-conscious. But day by day, she learned to ignore them. She focused instead on how the walks made her feel, free, lighter, almost like she was shedding the weight of everything that had happened. One morning, as she sat on a park bench, watching children play and leaves fall gently from the trees, she noticed an older woman sitting beside her. The woman smiled kindly and said, "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Emily nodded, returning the smile. "Yes, it really is." The two of them struck up a conversation, Her name was Margaret, and she had lived in the neighborhood for years. Margaret had a way of speaking that put Emily at ease, as if she had known her for years. Eventually, the conversation turned personal, and Margaret shared her own story, a story of loss, betrayal, and starting over. "You know, dear," Margaret said, her voice soft but firm, "sometimes we have to lose everything to find ourselves again. Life has a way of giving us the tools to rebuild, even if we don't see them right away." Emily thought about Margaret's words long after they had said goodbye. It was the first time someone had spoken to her without judgment or pity. Margaret didn't see Emily as a woman abandoned by her husband or someone who had let herself go. She simply saw a person who had the potential to rebuild her life. Over the next few weeks, Emily began to find small joys in life again. She took up hobbies she had forgotten about, like painting and gardening. She found comfort in creating things with her own hands, things that reflected who she was, not who others expected her to be. But as Emily began to heal and rediscover herself, Richard's life was starting to unravel. Behind the scenes, the perfect image he tried so hard to maintain was beginning to crack. His new relationship, the one he had so proudly flaunted, wasn't turning out the way he had hoped. It seemed that appearances could only carry a relationship so far. Late one evening, Emily's phone rang. She didn't recognize the number at first, but curiosity got the better of her, and she picked it up. "Hello." There was silence for a moment before a familiar voice spoke. It was Richard. "Emily," he said quietly, almost hesitantly. I need to talk to you." Emily's heart raced as she held the phone to her ear, unsure of what to say. For months she had dreamed of this moment, of Richard coming back and realizing what he had done. But now that it was happening, it didn't feel the way she thought it would. "What do you want, Richard?" she asked, her voice steady. "I made a mistake," he replied, his words almost pleading. "I miss you, Emily. I miss us." Emily sat in silence, his words hanging in the air. Part of her wanted to believe him, to take him back and pretend the past had never happened. But another part of her, a stronger, wiser part, knew that things could never go back to the way they were. And as Richard waited for her response, Emily knew she had a choice to make. What happens next will leave you stunned. Stay tuned for the next part of Emily's journey, where she faces her past, her future, and a decision that will change everything. Emily sat there, holding the phone to her ear, the silence stretching between her and Richard like a heavy weight. His words echoed in her mind. "I miss you, Emily. I miss us." But they felt hollow, like a distant echo of a past that no longer belonged to her. For months, she had carried the pain of his rejection, his cruel words ringing in her ears. And now he was here, trying to undo it all with a single phone call. "What do you want, Richard?" she asked again, her voice calm but firm this time. She wasn't the same woman he had walked out on. I need to see you," he replied, his tone soft, almost vulnerable. "Can we meet? Please, Emily." Emily hesitated. There was a time when she would have dropped everything to hear him say those words, a time when his approval had been everything to her. But now, something felt different. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let him back into her life, even for a conversation. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice steady. Then she hung up. For the rest of the evening, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the call. Why now? What had changed? She didn't owe Richard anything, but a small part of her wanted to know what he had to say. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was the lingering hope that he would finally admit how wrong he had been. But deep down, she knew that no apology would ever erase the hurt he had caused. Over the next few days, Emily tried to focus on the progress she had been making. Her garden had begun to flourish, the bright blooms of roses and lavender filling the air with their fragrance. Painting had become a part of her daily routine, a quiet escape where she could lose herself in colors and brushstrokes. She had even started taking classes at a local art studio, where she met other women who shared similar stories of heartbreak and reinvention. It was comforting to know she wasn't alone. But Richard's words lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. One evening, as Emily was tidying up her kitchen, the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, she walked to the door and opened it. Standing there, looking far less confident than she remembered, was Richard. "Emily," he said, his voice soft, almost unsure of himself. She blinked, taken aback by his sudden appearance. He looked different, tired, worn down. The sharpness she remembered in his features had softened, and his perfectly tailored suits had been replaced with something much more casual. He didn't look like the Richard she had known, the man who had walked out on her without hesitation. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone firm but not unkind. I wanted to see you," he said, looking at her with eyes that seemed to carry regret. "Can I come in?" Emily hesitated. Every instinct told her to say no, to shut the door and protect the new life she had been building. But curiosity got the better of her, and after a long pause, she stepped aside. "Fine, but I don't have much time." Richard walked into the house, looking around as if he was seeing it for the first time. It was the same house they had shared, but something about it had changed. Emily had filled it with plants, soft blankets, and paintings that made the space feel warm and alive. It was a reflection of the woman she was becoming, not the woman he had left. "Your place looks different," Richard said quietly, almost as if he were talking to himself. "People change," Emily replied simply. She crossed her arms and looked at him. "What do you want, Richard?" He turned to face her, the confidence that had always defined him seeming to falter. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice breaking. "Leaving you was the worst decision I've ever made." Emily stared at him, searching his face for sincerity. "And you realize that now? Why? What happened to the perfect life you traded me for?" Richard sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "It wasn't perfect," he admitted. "It never was. I thought I wanted something new, someone different. But I was wrong. I was selfish. And I see that now." Emily let his words hang in the air, watching him carefully. For so long, she had replayed this moment in her mind, imagining what she would say if he ever came back. She had pictured herself breaking down, forgiving him or maybe yelling at him for the hurt he caused. But standing here now, she felt none of that. Instead, she felt strong, stronger than she had in years. "You think you can just come back here and say you're sorry?" Emily asked, her voice steady. "That you can undo everything you did with a few words?" Richard looked down at the floor, shame written across his face. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to know that I regret everything." Emily took a deep breath, trying to make sense of her emotions. She had spent so long waiting for this moment, for him to admit he was wrong. And now that it was here, it didn't bring the closure she thought it would. Maybe closure wasn't something Richard could give her. Maybe it was something she had to find on her own. "Richard," she said finally, her voice soft but firm, "I spent years living for you, trying to be the woman you wanted me to be. And when I didn't fit that image anymore, you threw me away. I won't let you do that to me again." He looked up at her, pain flickering in his eyes. "Emily, She held up a hand, stopping him. "No, Richard, this isn't about you anymore. I'm not the same woman you left, and I don't need your regret to move on. I deserve more than this, more than you." For the first time, Emily saw the truth settle on Richard's face. He realized, perhaps too late, that he had lost something he could never get back. As he left the house, Emily stood by the window, watching him walk down the driveway. She felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and something she couldn't quite name. But one thing was clear. This chapter of her life was closing, and a new one was beginning. Later that night, as Emily sat in her studio, painting under the soft glow of the lamp, she smiled to herself. She wasn't defined by her past or by the way someone else saw her. For the first time in years, she felt free to be herself, to embrace the woman she was becoming. But what Emily didn't know was that her journey was far from over. Life had more surprises waiting for her, and the decisions she made now would shape everything that came next. The days after Richard's visit were a whirlwind of emotions for Emily. She tried to carry on as she had before, her morning walks, afternoons painting, evenings tending to her blooming garden. But something had shifted. His sudden reappearance stirred memories and feelings she thought she had buried long ago. She questioned herself late at night, staring at the ceiling as sleep escaped her. Was she really as strong as she believed, or had Richard's return unearthed doubts she wasn't ready to face? Emily wasn't sure why, but the words he had said haunted her. "I regret everything." They echoed in her mind at the quietest of moments, making her wonder if she had been too harsh, too unyielding. It wasn't that she wanted him back. The part of her that still loved Richard was long gone, replaced by the knowledge of what he had done, how easily he had thrown her away. But somewhere, deep inside, she wanted him to understand, not just regret, but truly understand the damage he had caused. Her routine continued as normal. The calm she had worked so hard to build felt fragile, like a glass house waiting to shatter. One afternoon, Emily was at the local art studio. She stood in front of her easel, a half. The next morning, Emily stood in front of her mirror, her hands smoothing the fabric of her dress. She didn't dress up for Richard, she dressed for herself. She wanted to face him as the woman she had become, not the woman he had left behind. Strong, confident, and unafraid of what was coming next. When she arrived at the small cafe, Richard was already there, sitting at a table in the corner. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment, Emily saw a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, or maybe realization. "Thank you for coming," Richard said quietly as she sat down. Emily met his gaze, her expression calm but unreadable. "Say what you need to say, Richard." The tension between them was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to break. Richard took a deep breath, his hands clasped on the table. "I didn't know what I had until I lost it, Emily. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I was too blind to see it. I thought I wanted something better, but there is no better without you." Emily listened, her face unreadable, as Richard's words tumbled out. She felt her pulse quicken, the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on her. But this time, she wasn't the same woman sitting across from him. What happens next will leave you breathless. Stay tuned as Emily's story builds to the moment of truth, when she must decide whether to confront her past or leave it behind forever. Emily stared at Richard across the small table, his words echoing in her mind. The cafe seemed to fade around her, the distant clatter of cups and quiet murmur of conversations dissolving into silence. "There is no better without you." A sentence so simple, yet it carried the weight of their shared past, of promises broken, of pain still raw. Emily kept her expression steady, but inside, her emotions churned. "Why now?" she asked quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. "What happened that made you realize all this?" Richard looked down, his hands clasped tightly together, the polished confidence she remembered nowhere to be seen. He hesitated before speaking, his voice lower than before. "Things didn't turn out the way I thought they would," he admitted. "I make mistakes, Emily. I thought I was chasing happiness, but all I found was emptiness. The woman I left you for, she left me. She only cared about the things I could give her." The words hung in the air, bitter and sharp. For a moment, Emily felt a flicker of something close to pity, but she quickly pushed it away. "And now you're here because you think I'll fix what's broken in you?" she asked, her voice steady. Richard looked up, his expression raw. "No," he said quickly. "I don't expect you to fix anything. I need you to know I regret it. I was wrong. And I've been carrying that every single day since." Emily held his gaze, searching his face for sincerity. She didn't doubt that Richard felt regret. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in the cracks in his voice. But she also knew that regret wasn't enough. It didn't erase the years she spent feeling invisible, the nights she spent questioning her worth, or the way he had torn her apart so effortlessly. Richard, she began slowly, carefully choosing her words. What you're feeling now, this emptiness, this regret, it's yours to carry, not mine. I spent so long letting you define me, but I won't do that anymore. The look in his eyes changed, as though he had just realized the truth in her words. Richard had expected Emily to still be the woman he left behind, broken, desperate for his approval. But the woman sitting across from him now was someone he didn't recognize. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't forgiving either. She was simply free. Richard opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could say anything, the sharp ring of Emily's phone interrupted them. She glanced down, surprised to see an unknown number flashing across the screen. For a brief moment, she considered ignoring it, but something, an instinct perhaps, made her answer. Hello. There was silence on the other end, followed by a faint, unsteady voice. Is this Emily Morgan? Yes, Emily said cautiously. Who is this? The voice trembled slightly. This is Carla. The woman hesitated, as though choosing her words carefully. You don't know me, but I think we need to talk. It's about Richard. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at him across the table. He was watching her closely, his brow furrowed in confusion. Who are you? Emily asked again, keeping her voice calm despite the sudden knot forming in her chest. I can't explain over the phone, Carla said, her voice breaking. Please meet me. I think you deserve to know the truth about everything. The line went dead before Emily could ask anything else. She sat there frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear as questions swirled in her mind. Who was this woman? What did she mean by the truth? Finished painting of the garden outside her window staring back at her. She had been coming here for weeks now, finding solace in the colors and creativity. But today she couldn't focus. Every brushstroke felt off, disconnected. It was as though her heart wasn't in it, distracted by thoughts she couldn't push away. Emily, are you all right? A voice asked from behind her. It was Margaret, the older woman she had met weeks ago in the park, now one of the few people Emily had allowed into her life. Emily turned, forcing a smile. I'm fine. Just having an off day, I guess. Margaret raised an eyebrow, setting her own supplies down. You've been somewhere else lately, she said softly. Is it Richard? Emily sighed. Margaret had a way of seeing through her, as if she could read the truth in her eyes. He came back, she admitted quietly. Out of nowhere, he said he regrets leaving me. And do you believe him? Margaret asked, her tone gentle but firm. Emily hesitated. I don't know. Part of me doesn't want to care. But another part of me, I don't know why I can't just let it go. Margaret stepped closer, her expression thoughtful. Sometimes the hardest thing to let go of isn't the person, it's the idea of what they meant to you. You gave so much of yourself to Richard, Emily. It's natural to wonder why he came back, or if he sees now what you're worth. But you don't need his regrets to prove that to yourself. Margaret's words stayed with Emily as she packed up her supplies and left the studio. The evening air was crisp and cool as she walked home, her thoughts swirling in her mind. She tried to remind herself of the progress she had made, the strength she had found. But the past has a way of creeping back when you least expect it, and that night, it showed up again in the most unexpected way. As Emily unlocked the door to her house, she noticed something on the porch. It was a bouquet of roses, fresh, bright red, and carefully arranged. A small envelope was tucked inside the flowers. Emily's heart sank as she picked it up, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the note. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I hope you'll let me prove I can change. Richard. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the words as her emotions clashed. Anger, confusion, and a sliver of something she couldn't quite name. Pity, maybe? Richard's regret had turned into a pursuit, and Emily wasn't sure what he wanted from her anymore. Did he think flowers and pretty words could undo everything that had happened? She brought the roses inside, though part of her wanted to leave them on the porch. As she placed them on the table, Their presence felt out of place in her home, like an uninvited guest that didn't belong. Emily couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her chest. Richard's actions had always been calculated, his charm like a mask he wore to get what he wanted. And now Emily found herself questioning his motives. The next day, as she walked through town to clear her head, Emily spotted Richard sitting at a cafe across the street. He was alone, a cup of coffee in front of him, staring at nothing in particular. Seeing him there felt surreal, like a ghost from her past appearing in broad daylight. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the street. Richard looked up and seemed almost surprised to see her, but Emily quickly turned and walked away. That evening, just as Emily was settling in with a cup of tea, the phone rang again. She stared at it for a long time before answering. "Hello. Emily, it's me." Richard's voice was quiet, careful. She sighed, her exhaustion bleeding through her words. "What do you want, Richard?" I wanted to see you again. Please, Emily, just one conversation. That's all I'm asking." His voice held a pleading tone she hadn't heard before, but Emily's patience was wearing thin. "Richard, you don't get to walk back into my life and pretend like nothing happened. You don't get to fix this with flowers and apologies." "I know," he said quickly. "I know I can deserve it. But there are things I need to say, things I should have said a long time ago." Emily's mind raced. She didn't owe him anything, and yet something inside her, a need for closure, perhaps, made her pause. "Fine," she said finally. "Tomorrow. One conversation. That's it." When Emily hung up the phone, her heart was pounding. She wasn't sure why she had agreed to meet him. Maybe she wanted answers, or maybe she wanted to look him in the eye one last time and say the words she had never been able to say before. Whatever it was, she knew it wouldn't be easy.
"Who was that?" Richard asked, his voice cautious, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Emily set the phone down and looked at him, her gaze sharp. "Someone who seems to know you better than I do," she replied coolly. "Care to explain?" Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his posture stiffening. "I don't know who that could be," he said quickly, though something about the way he avoided her gaze made her stomach tighten. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air heavy with unspoken words. Emily could feel it. There was something he wasn't telling her, something that made her instinctively put her guard up. "I have to go," she said suddenly, pushing back her chair. Richard stood up quickly, his face panicked. "Emily, wait. Please," he said, reaching for her arm. "Whatever that was, don't let it ruin this." She pulled her arm back before he could touch her. "This," she repeated, her voice sharp. "There is no this, Richard. You lost that right a long time ago." Without another word, Emily walked out of the cafe, her heart pounding. She had no idea who Carla was, but something about that call had sent a chill through her. It felt like the calm before a storm, as though her past with Richard was unraveling in ways she couldn't yet see. The next morning, Emily sat at a quiet table in the park, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee as she waited. The air was crisp, and the faint rustling of leaves filled the silence. She spotted a woman walking toward her, young, maybe in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with nervousness. "Emily?" the woman asked hesitantly as she approached. Emily nodded, her pulse quickening. "You're Carla?" The woman sat down across from her, clutching her bag tightly, as though it might keep her steady. She looked at Emily for a long moment before speaking. "I don't even know where to begin," she said quietly. "But you need to know what kind of man Richard really is. He's not who you think he is." Emily frowned, confusion washing over her. "What are you talking about?" Carla took a deep breath, her voice shaking. "I was with him too, after he left you, and I wasn't the only one. But it's not just that. There's more. Richard isn't just a liar, Emily. He's dangerous. Emily felt the blood drain from her face as Carla's words sank in. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. What do you mean, dangerous? Carla's hands trembled as she pulled something out of her bag, a folder thick with papers. She placed it on the table, her eyes filled with something Emily couldn't quite place. Fear. I found this, Carla whispered. You need to see it. You need to know the truth before it's too late. Emily stared at the folder, her heart pounding louder than it ever had before. The world seemed to tilt as 1,000 questions flooded her mind. Who was Richard, really? What had he done? And what did this woman know that Emily didn't? As she reached for the folder, the air around her felt heavy, charged with the weight of a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. What Emily would discover next would change everything about Richard, about her past, and about the life she thought she knew. Emily's hand hovered over the folder, her heart pounding as though the world had paused around her. The woman across from her, Carla, watched in silence, her face pale and drawn. Finally, Emily took a deep breath and opened it. Inside were papers, photos, and documents she didn't yet understand. But as her eyes scanned the pages, the truth began to unravel. At first, it didn't make sense. Financial statements, emails, legal notices. Then she saw it. Richard's name, repeated again and again, attached to suspicious transactions and debts hidden under layers of false identities. The man who had presented himself as a successful businessman, someone admired for his wealth and power, had been living a lie. He wasn't just dishonest in his personal life. He had been gambling everything: his money, his reputation, even other people's trust, and he was losing. Emily looked up, her hands shaking as she placed the papers on the table. Where did you get these? Carla swallowed hard. I found them in his office. I worked for him, Emily. At first, I thought I was just another person he could manipulate, someone to keep his secrets. But then I started piecing it together. Richard's in deeper than you realize. He's been borrowing money he can't repay, lying to business partners, to everyone. And now they're after him. Emily's pulse quickened. What do you mean, they? Carla leaned forward, her voice low. The people he owes. Powerful people. They don't care about excuses, and Richard knows it. That's why he came to you.
When the call ended, Emily stared out the window, the world outside quiet and still. She thought about the man Richard had been, the life they once shared, and how everything had unraveled. It wasn't the ending she expected, but maybe it was the only ending possible. In that moment, Emily realized something. She wasn't defined by Richard or the pain he had caused. She had faced him, faced the truth, and come out stronger. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. The woman Richard abandoned was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and unshakable. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily smiled to herself, knowing she had finally reclaimed her life. In the days following the news of Richard's death, Emily found herself drifting between emotions she couldn't quite name. There was no relief, no joy in hearing about what had happened to him. If anything, it left her with an unexpected sense of emptiness, like the final chapter of a book she had been forced to read but didn't choose. Richard was gone, and with him the shadow he had cast over her life. The funeral was held in a quiet, modest church a few towns over. Emily didn't plan to attend, but something inside her told her she needed to. Not for Richard, but for herself, to close the door on the past and truly let it go. When she arrived, she sat quietly in the back, unseen by the handful of mourners who had come. There weren't many. Richard, for all his charm and appearances, had pushed away the people who once cared for him. His choices had led him to this moment, and Emily couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for the life he had thrown away. After the service, as people trickled out of the church, Emily stayed behind for a moment. She walked up to the casket, her footsteps echoing softly on the tiled floor. Standing there, she looked at the man who had once been such a large part of her life. "You were right about one thing," she whispered, her voice steady. "I didn't know what I had until I lost it. But it wasn't you, it was myself." She turned and walked away without looking back, the final goodbye she hadn't known she needed now behind her. In the weeks that followed, Emily felt a strange sense of calm settle into her life. She spent her days tending to her garden, painting in the studio, and finding joy in small, quiet moments. She hadn't realized how much space Richard's chaos had taken up in her life until it was gone. For the first time in years, her world was her own. Margaret visited often, bringing her laughter and stories that filled the house with warmth. One afternoon, as they sipped tea in the garden, Margaret looked at her thoughtfully. "You've come so far, Emily," she said softly. "I hope you see that." Emily smiled as she looked around her. The garden was alive with color, vibrant roses, wildflowers, and lavender swaying gently in the breeze. "I do," she replied. "For so long, I thought I needed someone else to tell me who I was, to make me feel loved or worthy. But I see now that I had to find it for myself." Margaret nodded, her expression soft. "You know, life has a way of teaching us what we need to learn. Sometimes the hardest things we go through are the ones that show us how strong we really are." Emily thought about that as she worked on a new painting later that evening. It was a large canvas, one of the biggest she'd ever attempted. The strokes of her brush were confident, bold, and free. This time, the painting wasn't of flowers or landscapes. It was of a woman standing alone, looking out at an open horizon. The figure wasn't sad or broken. She was calm, strong, and ready for whatever lay ahead. A few weeks later, Emily received a letter in the mail. It was from Richard's lawyer, notifying her that he had left a portion of his remaining assets to her. She stared at the letter for a long moment, unsure of how to feel. It wasn't much. Most of his fortune had disappeared into debts and failed ventures, but it was enough to start fresh if she wanted to. Emily didn't need the money, but she saw it as something else. A reminder that she had survived everything Richard had put her through. She decided to use it for something good, something that mattered. Over the next few months, Emily poured her time and energy into her art. She held her first small gallery show at the local studio, displaying the pieces she had created during her journey of healing. The room buzzed with quiet admiration as visitors wandered through, pausing to take in the colors and stories woven into each canvas. Margaret stood by her side, beaming with pride. As Emily looked around the gallery, she saw faces, some familiar, others strangers, connecting with the work she had created. It was a reflection of her journey, the pain, the loss, a rediscovery of herself. In that moment, she realized how far she had come. One woman approached her, stopping at the painting of the lone figure on the horizon. "This one is my favorite," the woman said softly. "There's so much strength in it. It feels hopeful." Emily smiled, her heart swelling. "Thank you," she replied. "That's exactly what I hoped to share." As the night ended and the last of the guests trickled out, Emily stepped outside for a moment to breathe in the cool evening air. She looked up at the dark sky, the stars scattered across it like tiny beacons of light. For the first time in years, Emily felt a deep, unshakable peace. The past, with all its pain and heartache, was behind her. Richard's choices no longer had power over her, and the person she had become was someone she could be proud of. She hadn't just survived, she'd flourished. In the months that followed, Emily's life continued to blossom. Her art gained recognition in nearby towns, and she began teaching small workshops, helping others find healing through creativity. Her home, once a place of emptiness and sadness, was now filled with laughter, light, and life. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden with a sketch pad in her lap, she felt the breeze brush against her face. The flowers swayed gently, and she smiled to herself. She had come to realize something simple yet profound. Happiness wasn't something someone else could give her. It was something she had to create for herself. And in that moment, surrounded by the beauty she had rebuilt, Emily knew she was finally free. Free from the past, free from regret, and free to embrace the life she had created on her own terms. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow across the garden, Emily picked up her brush and began to paint again. This time, there were no shadows, no hesitation, only light, hope, and endless possibilities stretching out before her.